want to welcome all of you to the forum tonight, to the Rosenmeier Forum on State and Local Government. You will always be impressed with our speaker for tonight. It's always my privilege to mention the fact that Gordon Rosenmeier, who the Rosenmeier Center is named after, was the single most powerful, the most effective, and the most influential and respected legislator in all of Minnesota history. So we want to continue that legacy, and I'm proud of the fact that we can continue that legacy with the very unique public forum that we have in Minnesota here at Central Lakes College. We're one of the very few colleges in Minnesota, if any, that has this kind of a public forum. It is my privilege tonight to introduce to you somebody who needs no introduction, a honorable and great public servant who is a member of the Minnesota House of Representatives, a member of the Congress of the United States for 12 years, serving 2 congressional districts in the state of Minnesota. Rick Nolan is going to make the introduction of our speaker, and I want to mention one more thing about Congressman Nolan. The fact that he's one of the few people still around in Minnesota who had the distinction and honor of serving with Gordon Rosenmeier in the legislature in the 1969 legislative session. Difference was that Rick Nolan was 25 years old at the time, Gordon Rosenmeier was 60. And so, with no further ado, it is my distinct honor to introduce to you Congressman Richard Nolan.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction. I'll probably get Steve in trouble, being that Steve's a good Republican and I'm a good Democrat. Steve managed my first campaign that I won. Thank you for that, Stephen. And we've remained good friends ever since. I was once told that it's not a bad idea to, interject a little humor from time to time. And I've been just dying to tell this story to an audience of any size, and this is certainly good enough and big enough, okay? So infrastructure, as you know, is been in the headlines a lot lately. And I served on the infrastructure committee. So we had a bill up, and the night before, I'd been invited to a dinner with a Republican consultant, and I was quite thrilled when only 3 of us were there. I learned later that 300 people had been invited. I was just one of the 3 that showed up. And it was the fellow by the name of Lunt. And he said, among other things, if you have to read your speech, don't bother giving it. It just doesn't ring with authenticity. And I was used to, getting up and at least having a few key words. So I figured, well, this guy, he's a good advisor. I'm going to do that. So I got up on the floor of the House the next day, and I said, everybody that's come before the Infrastructure Committee, I don't care if it was the head of the Chamber of Commerce or the head of the AFL-CIO, I don't care if it was the consumers, or if it was the producers, where it was the unions or the non-unions. They've all said the same 3 things. And it dawned on me I could only remember 2 of them. I'm not making this up. And it's quite amazing how your mind can be going all over the place. Your mouth is still slapping. So my first thought was, geez, Nolan, why did you have to say the same 3 things? Why didn't you just say they said the same things? You wouldn't be in this predicament. Well, just keep talking. God willing, and the creek don't rise, the 3rd one will come to you, okay? Well, I finished my first point, and it didn't, okay? And then I looked out across the House of Representatives, and nobody was there. So I thought, well, at least nobody's here listening to me. And then it dawned on me, no, there's 50,000 people watching CNN, or 55 million people watching CNN every day. And I thought, gee, don't they have anything better to do? You know, Rick, don't stand here like a dummy and have your Rick Perry moment. You all remember that? Yeah. Going to eliminate 3 agencies of the federal government. Let me see, I can't remember them all, but I'm going to eliminate them. So I said, just keep talking, Rick, just keep talking. You're going to have to make something up. I gave my second point, and it still hadn't come to me. So I'm really panicking now. Oh, this is awful. What a way to go, Nolan. Well, repeat that second point again for emphasis. I did, still didn't come to me, so I decided to embellish a little bit, and hallelujah, the gods of rhetoric came to my rescue, and I remembered it. But I've never prepared for anything ever since with a prepared text, but I always remember to bring a couple of notes along, just in case I lose track. So, Steve, thank you for that introduction. Thank all of you for being here this evening for this most important forum. It's no secret that President Biden has, through executive order, reversed a number of the things that the Trump administration had done by executive order, replacing many of the things that the Obama administration had done by executive order, replacing some of the other things that another administration had done by executive order. And it begs the question of how much power has been conceded by the Congress of the United States to the President of the United States. And we're fortunate tonight here to have a diplomat extraordinaire who served in the State Department back in the Vietnam era when all the trouble and conflict was taking place in Southeast Asia. He served in Moscow when Gorbachev was emerging and the Eastern Bloc was collapsing, and he's even had a few sunshine posts from time to time to relieve the stress in places like Norway. But he served in so many important diplomatic positions at times of great strife and challenge and difficulty for our country. And of course, the Rosenmeier Forum primary purpose is to bring speakers who can help educate, illuminate, inform us on the public policies that affect us here, not just in central Minnesota, but in the state, in the nation, and even globally. Because like it or not, all of those issues affect us in many ways, and some of which are profound. So it's a great honor that we would have such a distinguished diplomat who's now the diplomat in residence at the Allworth Foreign Policy Institute at the University of Minnesota in Duluth. And he's going to help us clarify where we're headed, what the meaning is of what we're experiencing today in our local, state, national, and global politics, and help us to better understand the significance of what that might mean for all of us. So it's with that, I'm pleased to introduce to you all, please give a nice warm welcome to Tom Hanson, Diplomat.
Well, thank you very much, Rick, for those kind words, and for all you've done in your wonderful career. Over dinner, we were hearing of Rick's diplomatic endeavors back at a time when he was very key in U.S. relations with Cuba, actually having a chance to negotiate directly with Castro to free Americans who were being held and things like that. So your diplomatic career is also amazing, Rick, and it was a pleasure to hear more about it. And Steve, thank you once again. It's great to be here in person. Last year we did this on Zoom, of course. Everything's been on Zoom. Hopefully from now on we'll be meeting in person like this. And it's a real pleasure now to do this speech about the 10 most important Disney films of the past 30 years. No, I'm going to get back up here in the, yes, there we go. There. So, with that, I think we're on our way. I'll be talking tonight about our foreign policy and the amazing and growing number of challenges facing our country and actually facing the planet and the species, if you will, in this era. It's a very complicated time. A lot of material to cover. I'll try to weave some points together here as best I can. It's been about 10 months now of the Joe Biden administration, and so I'll be talking about the changes. As Rick pointed out very astutely, a lot is being done by executive order, and I'll talk about that because for our allies, the fact that policies are so easily enacted and then undone back and forth is leading to an image of the United States as a somewhat unpredictable country because there have not been majorities in Congress for a long time to submit things as treaties or to get major legislation on foreign affairs passed. So the point that Rick raised is actually very important right now as the Biden administration tries to restore U.S. leadership in the world. He's got a tall order. Any president coming in right now at this juncture would have a very tall order in trying to reassert America's position. As Joe Biden has said, his goal is to have America win the 21st century, whatever that means. But there are so many obstacles, and I'm going to cite four kind of background issues or trade-offs, contradictions that are going to be with us for a long time and that are going to shape the specific policies. I'm talking about the first one is the trade-off between the stimulus that we've been enacting really since 2008, since the crisis of 2008. We've been flooding the economy with printed money, as have the Europeans, the Japanese with Abenomics, Chinese in their own way. The world is awash in liquidity, and huge debts are resulting. So between the stimulus and the need to continue the stimulus now with the COVID crisis and the mounting debt that we and other countries are taking on is a major problem going forward. The second one is the dichotomy between technology, the new technologies, and democracy. It's very unclear at this juncture where these new technologies, AI, quantum, are leading. Will a democracy be able to survive in this technological era? The Chinese are convinced that their form of government is the one that is conducive to the new technologies. They're absolutely convinced of that. So this is a huge trade-off, and I'll be talking about this because the Biden administration is trying to address this. The third of these four is the dichotomy between the need for green technologies, green energy, sustainability, which we've all seen now at COP26 this past week, and the short-term costs that are involved. Part of the dislocations that we're seeing around the world right now, it's COVID in part, but it's also in some cases countries that are enacting green policies, including China, which are leading now to shortages. It's the middle and lower middle class that will bear the brunt of the first stages towards sustainability reform. We've already seen this in a number of countries. This trade-off will be so important. And then the fourth, actually I've forgotten the fourth one. God. Rick, throw me a line here. I got Thank you very much. Yeah. Oh, okay. So the fourth one, and maybe the most important, is between the reappearance now of great power competition, contention, which is what the Biden administration is all about. I'll be talking about this. The main focus of the policy now is a growing competition and contention with the rising power of China. It's traditional great power geopolitics returning. On the other hand, though, we're going to have cooperation with countries like China to meet the shared global threats that are out there. Pandemics, climate change, the new technologies which have to be brought under control. There again, we're going in two directions. And you could see this, the tensions at the COP26, the first days of it, when China didn't show up. Biden used COP26 to basically bash Beijing for not attending. I'll talk more about this as we go along, but so these four dichotomies or trade-offs are kind of in the background of all we'll be discussing tonight. So it's 10 months now. 10 months ago, Joe Biden, 20th of January, assumed the presidency. You know, it was a smooth transition. I mean, Trump did not attend, of course. He left early. But what really marked this occasion was what had happened 2 weeks before. You know, we really, and this picture shows what a massive, massive event this was on January 6th. This was huge. And, you know, we are all still trying to wrap our minds around what happened, as are our allies and other countries around the world trying to figure out. This incident is part of what is making us appear to be a factor of instability or uncertainty, at least, in the world order. That's a commonly held view now. The United States, that Joe Biden can promise all kinds of things, but starting with the midterms next year and then in 2024, this could all be reversed. It's very difficult right now, especially when we're asking a lot of our allies as we try to stand up to China. So what Rick pointed out about the use of executive orders to do and undo policies, and then this sort of emblem of our polarization as a country are two things that any president now has to deal with. As Joe Biden said in his sort of de facto State of the Union on April 28th, speaking to Congress, he said, "In my conversations with world leaders, I've made it known that America is back." And do you know what they say? The comment I hear most of all from them is they say, "We see America's back, but for how long? But for how long?" This is Biden speaking to Congress and reporting on what he hears from world leaders. Now, Biden set right to work day one, straight from his inaugural address, signed a slew of executive orders, 15 of them. The key ones had to do with health. We rejoined the World Health Organization, which the Trump administration had pulled us out of. We reestablished the National Security Council Directorate for Global Health Security and Biodefense, which had been disbanded by Trump in the months leading up to the emergence of COVID. It was really a tragic thing that we were, in a sense, flying blind at that point. He rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, which we actually had never really left because it takes like 2 years to finally withdraw, and we were still kind of de facto, at least at meetings, even during the Trump administration. But symbolically, we were out. He abolished the Muslim travel ban and halted construction on the U.S.-Mexico border wall. So all of these were highly significant steps undoing Trump's policies, just as Trump had undone Obama's policies right from the start in his administration as well. Going the wrong way there. So then a few days later, Biden appeared at the State Department and filled out a few more of his policies, once again reversing those of Trump. He focused on refugees. Now, traditionally, we have let in, well, going back far enough, up to 100,000 refugees a year. This is not just immigrants, but actually refugees with refugee status. The numbers have gone down and down and down to the point where last year, the final year of the Trump administration, we had a cap of just 15,000 total refugees. And we usually bring in about half the number of the caps, which means we would have brought in maybe 7,000 refugees. So day one, Biden raised the cap on refugees to 125,000. Just boom like that. Now, within a matter of weeks, the immigration crisis appeared on our southern border, with many immigrants fleeing from the Northern Triangle countries. By the way, key part of that immigration is the violence to the south. The 20 most violent cities in the world are all to our south. They're all in Mexico and other parts of Latin America. And so people feel insecure. They're trying to get away. They're trying to come here. But politically, this was a very bad scene. And so Biden suddenly reversed his course, went from 125,000 cap back to 15, which shocked the left wing of the party. This amount of shifting early on. And so in response to that pressure, he upped it to 65,000. He sort of put it in the middle. Now that we are allowing in Afghan refugees, the first 50,000 Afghan refugees are arriving in Minnesota as we speak. He's raised it again to 125. So he's where he started out, but having gone through this roller coaster on refugees. You know, he's emphasizing our democratic values, our global leadership, the idea that we're going to outcompete China, and that to do that, we have to repair our alliances as a #1 priority. And in that, we're going to emphasize our strengths, one of which is democracy. And so we're going to convene a summit of democracies, a meeting of democracies. Now, this has been put off. It looks like it'll happen maybe next month, although even now it's still a little uncertain. But the intention is to invite democracies. Now, a number of our closest allies cannot be quite considered democracies at this point, which is a big problem. We really want to invite India, for example. And yet, under the Modi government, there are questions about democracy there right now. So also at the State Department, he announced the end of our support for offensive operations in Yemen, and in general, a turning away from Saudi Arabia. We are lessening our support for Saudi Arabia. We've taken our air defense installations out of Saudi Arabia, for example, sending a clear signal to MBS, Mohammed bin Salman. Now on human rights, he had a presidential declaration or memo to all government agencies, including the State Department, to actively support and protect LGBTQ issues around the world. This is something that Obama also did, so our embassies were actually, even in countries where, very conservative countries, were speaking out in favor of the rights for LGBTQ worldwide. We have a special envoy now in the State Department for that. And of course, human rights is back on the agenda, support for Navalny in Russia, democracy in Myanmar, all those things. So these were kind of the main accents in the very, very early days of the administration. Now, obviously, the U.S., the world is being buffeted now by the current stage of the COVID crisis with the Delta variant. There you can see, I guess that's sort of the old Delta, the old COVID virus, and then what Delta looks like. It's clear that this is, I mean, the lockdowns in Europe right now are severe. In the Netherlands, people who aren't vaccinated will not be allowed to leave their homes except to buy groceries. There will be controls on the streets. Anybody on the street without a vaccination card will face a heavy fine. This is in Austria now that's happening. But Germany's locking down to a great extent too. So the Delta variant is raging, and especially people, especially those who got the Pfizer inoculation, which fades. They're finding now it fades very fast. After 4 months, it starts to fade and goes down. The Israeli studies show goes down to 20% effectiveness. So there are a lot of inoculated people with fading protection, especially Pfizer doses. The Moderna dose is 3.5 times stronger than the Pfizer dose, 3.5 times. So the Moderna is lasting longer, apparently. So everyone now is scrambling to get everyone to get a booster in order to try to get this back under control. But the problem is things do seem to be slipping out of control, just in general. The other aspect, of course, is the supply chain crunch. We're all seeing the inflation. We can't get, you know, I depend on note cards for my speeches. I go to Staples, they don't have note cards. They haven't had them for 3 months. And of course, there are all kinds of other things that we're seeing. So these huge container ships that have been responsible for the on-time supply chains we're living with, where things come from far, far away. Companies don't want to have inventory on hand. They want stuff to arrive and immediately sell it. All this is messed up now. Here's a recent depiction of all of these massive container ships that are out there right now. Many of them are just parked. And you can see here the pattern of global trade on this graph. I've been asked, and I'm not sure exactly what the color differentiations are, whether one is a container ship with goods, and in other words, maybe with oil, or anyway, but that's what it looks like. This is global trade. And many, many countries now want to bring these supply chains back home, including the Biden administration. There's a lot of talk about protecting the middle class and no longer being reliant on this kind of trade. So this is adding to the crunch we're all feeling. Shipping costs are up between 5 and 10%. Raw material, food prices. There's a global semiconductor shortage right now that we hear about. Of course, labor shortages. All the while, demand is up. So we'll be living with this for a while. And the political implications of a sense that sort of globally and also with COVID, things are slipping a little bit out of control is something that the administration is really going to have to address. And it's going to be a tall order. Now, but the main thrust, and this is the title of my speech tonight, is from Afghanistan to China. And there's a totally bipartisan view now in Washington that our involvement in Afghanistan and also in Iraq, that was a horrendous mistake with a capital M. This was first enunciated by Jim Mattis in the new National Security Strategy, which came out in 2017, 2018. This is the Trump administration now. And that strategy said straight out, the United States made a huge mistake. We weakened ourselves. We drew down on our military assets. They don't use the word fool's errand, but that's really what they're talking about in Afghanistan and Iraq. And we have to extricate ourselves from these and turn to what is the real challenge. And that is the return of great power competition. Primarily China, but also Russia. In the Biden cosmology, the biggest geopolitical test for us is China, period. We have serious challenges, secondary category, with Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So they make a distinction between Russia and China and Russia there. And then there are crises brewing in Yemen, Ethiopia, and Myanmar. And you may have heard this mantra they have with China: we will compete where we can. We'll collaborate depending on circumstances, and we'll be adversarial where we must. So there's this kind of trying to subdivide the relationship. But so Mattis really laid out this idea that China was able to steal a march on us, has been rising during this whole 20-year period while we have had our eyes off the ball. And so all this came home to roost in the summer. This is the situation in Afghanistan on January 9th, 2021. You can see that the Taliban in red controlled parts of the country, but by far not the majority of the country. ISIS-K, which stands for ISIS Khorasan, in blue, very few areas. And just about 6 months later, you had this. You had the Taliban in the president's office because Ghani had fled by then. So this reversal is just mind-spinning. Now, everyone agrees that we should get out. There's nobody who disagrees with that. Although the military wanted a small military presence, but the problem is, from the very start, the Taliban has had one negotiating point, only one: all foreign troops out of Afghanistan, period. Anything short of that is not on. And so, they've been threatening to attack our forces. And so the Trump administration in February 2020 reached a deal with the Taliban. We would withdraw all of our troops, everybody, our NATO allies too, by May 1st of this year. And we'll be gone. And then on that basis, the Taliban said, okay, we will not attack U.S. forces during that period. No such commitment about attacking Afghans or the Afghan government. So the Afghan government felt left in the lurch by this deal because we didn't consult with them, the government we created. We didn't consult with our allies either in this decision. So it's been a ticking clock ever since. And so Biden was able to extend to August 31st. The Taliban were not attacking our troops, but it was clear we had to be out. And of course, the chaos that ensued was a real negative for the sitting administration. And the fact that Americans died in a car bomb attack, and the fact that our last act in Afghanistan was to kill a family of 10 as we left, which brings to mind what the Russian ambassador in Kabul, who had been the KGB chief when Russia tried to dominate Afghanistan, just as the British tried, and everyone has tried, and nobody has succeeded. And he would have people over to his residence in Kabul, and just at a certain point in the evening, describe the 3 reasons why America would fail in Afghanistan and why the Russians had failed. And they are, and I'll try to remember all 3 of them here, because I have them written down. First, he said, and the Russians have occupied a lot of countries, he said, but they've never been in a place with such a visceral reaction by the local people against any foreign occupation. He said, you have to have experienced Afghanistan to realize how strong this opposition is to anybody intruding from the outside. Second, he said, you don't know who is who. You can train forces, and then they turn on you. And this is, it's a medieval, deep society, clans. Foreigners are not really being let in on what's going on. That's why our intelligence was caught with its pants down, frankly, when suddenly all these local warlords caved. And it was clear that deals had been signed probably months before with the Taliban. And we had no inkling that this was going on. We had no idea. And it's because of this point. And then finally, and this gets into our final act in Afghanistan, this Russian ambassador said, civilian casualties will doom your mission. That the Afghans react very, very strongly to that, and of course there's been a lot of collateral damage in our time there. How do we get into this mess? What happened? Well, you have to go back, of course, to the aftermath of 9/11, when we were trying to decide what to do. At that point, Iraq was not on the table. Nobody was talking about going to Iraq yet. But when it came to Afghanistan, there was a big meeting. I learned this from a guy named Douglas Feith, who had been Cheney's guy. He used to talk about Feith-based intelligence. I heard him speaking at a conference. And he described the meeting now that took place. You had Colin Powell from the State Department, you had Cheney, you had Rumsfeld, you had the CIA. What do we do about Afghanistan? Colin Powell in the State Department, policy planning at State, the CIA all said, look, we have to go in and get Al-Qaeda, but we must leave the Taliban in place. Because the Taliban are the Pashtuns, and the Pashtuns have always held the upper hand in Afghanistan. We'll get into a civil war we can never win. And so they were for a surgical strike to get bin Laden, and to work with Pakistan to box in the Taliban then. And we threatened Pakistan at the time. But we told them we were going to leave the Taliban in place, because the Taliban is their ally. But on the other side, you had Dick Cheney and you had Rumsfeld saying we can't take the risk. We've got to remove the Taliban too. And their argument won the day. Now the problem was, at this point, you had bin Laden cornered in the mountains of Tora Bora, as you can see from this map, right next to the Pakistan border. The Pakistanis had promised us to keep the border sealed and to keep bin Laden from getting out so we could get him. Once they found out that we had changed our policy and that we were going to bring in something called the Northern Alliance, which is from the north of Afghanistan, it's Uzbeks, Hazaras, Tajiks, not Pashtun. And they are close to India. We brought in a government in Kabul that was basically an ally of India. For Pakistan, that was it. And ever since, from that day, they've been trying to oppose and frustrate everything we've done in Afghanistan, adding to our problems. And lo and behold, they opened the border. Bin Laden escaped. I'm convinced that the Pakistani intelligence took Bin Laden in hand right on that day, and had been protecting him ever since. You know, he was eventually killed in a military installation right next in a secure area next to a Pakistani military base. It's what it is, and we spent 20 years doing this. Biden, when Obama came in, there was talk about getting out. Biden was in favor of getting out, but at that point, the military still wanted to keep a residual force, and quite frankly, some of the women in the Obama administration, Hillary Clinton, Susan Rice, Samantha Power, had become very concerned about the plight of women in Afghanistan. And that became a deciding argument for staying longer. And so you had basically Hillary and Bob Gates and others joining in the military against Biden. So by the time Biden became president, he was frustrated. He wanted us to get out 10 years earlier. And he may have engaged in some haste in doing it. What's going to happen now? Well, one of my themes tonight is that the world is heading toward greater regionalization. Economic regionalization, but also political. You're going to have strong regional countries having an influence. And so Afghanistan now will get caught up in the regional dynamics of this part of Asia, particularly China, which is very close to Pakistan. This organization, the Trilateral Foreign Ministers meeting, has been getting together for years, the China, Afghanistan, Pakistan dialogue. This is, you know, China is ready to invest a lot of money in Afghanistan. Pakistan is happy that the Taliban is in power. And so, and Iran is starting to get close. We're trying to figure out now how to keep terrorism from rising, and we want to have what they call an over-the-horizon capability. We're not on the ground anymore. We've been ejected from being there physically, but we want to be nearby to monitor what's going on in there. And so, surprisingly, when we first went in there, the Russians were very accommodating. This was early in Putin's. He was the first person to call George W. Bush, offering support after 9/11, and so the Russians let us open up military bases in Uzbekistan, at Karshi, and in Kyrgyzstan at Manas. And those bases were very important, and also supply routes going through Russia to Afghanistan. This time, our number 3 person in the State Department, Victoria Nuland, went to Moscow and was told there will be no U.S. military presence in this entire region. We, Russia, will not allow you to open up in any of the stands. And the Taliban are also saying no American footprint. So it remains to be seen now how we are going to keep a handle on whatever terrorism may arise, because we are being ejected from this point of the world. Now, the 2 main advisors, and I'll talk more about them in a minute, Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, are getting some of the blame for the way the last days were handled. I'm just now repeating what people in D.C. are saying. Both Tony Blinken and Jake Sullivan, who's from the Twin Cities, by the way, were staffers for Biden. They both started off, Jake started working for Amy Klobuchar. They've never actually had positions of their own outside of the Democratic establishment advising Democratic candidates. I mean, people in D.C. now refer to them as the acolytes. You know, this is not Colin Powell. This is not George Shultz. It's not James Baker. These guys are very bright, but the take in D.C. now is that, frankly, they may be a little bit in over their heads. Jake especially is very smart, but frankly, somewhat inexperienced. So, but they are the 2 key guys now for Biden. Here's, you know, on day 1, and you got Jake in the background there. Each one has I guess you'd say, a specialty or a take on foreign affairs. So we'll start with Jake, who he went to Southwest High School. The Sullivan family is very famous in the Southwest. They produced a number of really smart kids, and Jake is the one who's gone the farthest. Now he's the 2nd youngest national security advisor. Jake's whole focus is on the future. It's on the competition with China, especially the technological competition. They're getting ahead of us. There was a study done, headed up by Eric Schmidt of Google, which reported in January, National Security Commission on AI, which concluded that China is now ahead of us in AI and in quantum computing. We're still ahead in semiconductors, but the lead is shrinking. And so this commission has called for creating a whole new organization called the Technology Competitiveness Council, which would be like the NSC, with the same standing as the NSC to get at tech. So Jake is heading up all that. He's also for a foreign policy for the middle class. He stresses that. I think it's partly because he eventually wants to come back here to Minnesota and run for office, probably for the Senate. He sounded out a run when Obama was out, and I think next time it'll be more serious. He'll certainly have the support of Amy Klobuchar and other key people in the party. So Jake has brought on a guy named Dalip Singh, who is an economist and a specialist on tech, to look at repatriating supply chains, improving our industrial base, getting more R&D, and a greater government role, not just leave everything to the private sector. That's a long stretch because we are more deregulated now than we've ever been in our history, probably, well, at least in modern times. And really what they're talking about is a national industrial policy, which we used to have, especially like under Eisenhower in those years. But nobody dares say that. That phrase is toxic in Washington. It's like, what, the government's going to take over? You're not going to let the corporations do this? So they talk about it now as the intersection of economics and national security. That's the phrase. But it's basically the same idea. By the way, Mr. Singh is one of many Indian Americans in this administration, record number. Of course, starting with Kamala Harris as vice president. And yes, this is Zhenwei Pan, probably the Einstein of quantum. He's the mind that is driving China's development and surpassing us in quantum. So this is Jake's focus. Now, Tony Blinken, in contrast, is a little bit backward looking, I would say. He looks at the current era as the 1930s. In other words, just as in the 1930s, we had a rise of autocracy, and in that case, fascism, and America withdrew, and the result was World War II and the Holocaust and all these other things. The idea is we cannot let that happen again. America must reassert itself now. And Blinken's thoughts on this are reinforced by his best friend, who is Robert Kagan. These two are very close. They write a lot of articles together. Bob Kagan, and this kind of illustrates the blob in Washington, this group of foreign policy advisors who really share the same views, depending on whichever party. Bob Kagan was the main foreign policy advisor to Mitt Romney, to John McCain, 3 Republican presidents in a row. He's a neoconservative. And he's always had this idea of a league of democracies. For years, he's been saying we have to have a league of democracies. And that's now what Tony Blinken is also in favor of. So, and it's interesting that Bob Kagan's wife, Victoria Nuland, was named by Blinken the #3 person in the State Department. So this is, as I said, it's kind of a power conglomerate there at state, and it's having a big impact on the Biden. So between Blinken and Jake, you've got this. So the whole idea, and this is what Biden has been stressing from the beginning, we've got to mobilize our allies. We've got to galvanize our allies to back us up in standing up to China, both in Europe and in Asia. This is #1 priority. So obviously, Trump sort of dissed NATO in a number of ways. The relations were not good. Biden is trying to now very quickly restore. One of his first phone calls was to Jens Stoltenberg, the Norwegian Secretary General of NATO. They had a long conversation. It was shown live on YouTube. That's never happened before. The Biden team wanted to show how much we are now consulting with our allies. Now, in the States, there's support for what they're doing. China is one of the few things that people can agree on in Washington. In fact, I think it also almost serves a useful function in a very polarized situation. You can just invoke China and get people to agree on things, right? People talk about an enemy deprivation syndrome in Washington that we've been suffering since the end of the Cold War. Well, now we have a new kid on the block that we're concerned about. So, and this, of course, has been reinforced by U.S. opinion. The latest poll shows that number of unfavorable is up to 78% now. So it's tending upwards. Now, polling in Europe among our allies also shows that people are more skeptical of China. But here's a European Council on Foreign Relations poll that was done after January 6th, after our election. And there are two questions that really, I think, are indicative. So which of these statements best reflects your view? Now, the green is by far the majority, and green is Europe can't always rely on the U.S. We need to look after our own defense capabilities. This is this uncertainty I mentioned. I'm amazed that in Britain, if you look to the right there, only 3% think that the U.S. will always protect Europe. I wouldn't have predicted that, not among the Brits, but there you are. And on this question, if there was a disagreement between the U.S. and China, what would you like your country to do? Once again, the green is the majority. I would like my country to remain neutral. So the opinion base in Europe, frankly, is going to be hard to mobilize. Some of the governments want to go a long way in our direction to standing up to China, if you will, but opinion is at variance. And there are all kinds of signs, especially among the old Europeans, the Germans and the French, of not really wanting to stand up to either Russia or China, that they want to do business with these people. And of course, the best example of that is Germany, which has agreed to something called Nord Stream 2, which is the second undersea pipeline that will bring natural gas and oil to Europe straight from Russia. We tried to stop them from doing this, then they basically just ignored us. It's still being debated in Germany, and there's a new government there. But basically, this is finished now, and will be part of their energy. So now we turn to China and Russia, especially China and the U.S. One of the key issues here is, we have been the largest economy in the world since 1870. Unbroken run. The United States economy has been the largest on the planet. And in terms of the traditional GDP calculation, we still are, although now they're saying China will surpass us probably by about 2030. But when you take purchasing power parity, which is what like the World Bank uses and OECD, China surpassed us about 5 years ago. Now, not per capita, obviously, but in the aggregate. In fact, they're about a third larger than our economy. They are educating their population. The latest estimate is that for every one STEM graduate in the United States, there are 8 in China, and that by 2030, it'll be 1 to 15. They are investing massively in education, especially in tech. So this is a formidable challenge. China, of course, has a lot of problems, which I'll describe in a little bit later. But for the moment, Washington is only seeing their strengths and is trying to react. Now, Xi Jinping basically says, look, why get into a Cold War? There's no need. We are stressing that there's a rules-based order that China must adhere to. China's response is, yes, there is a rules-based order, and it is the UN Charter, which is what we adhere to, which is non-intervention in the affairs of other countries. It's a states-based set of rules. And so the Chinese are saying, your rules-based order is merely the American order from 1945, which has no standing because the world has changed a lot. You can't go backwards. So it's really a dialogue of the deaf on some pretty basic points. Now, Blinken echoed Mike Pompeo, the former Secretary of State, in declaring a genocide in Xinjiang, what the Chinese are doing with the Uyghurs. The Chinese had hoped that the Biden administration might back off a bit, but in fact, there's a lot of continuity between the Biden team and what Trump was doing, and that's this consensus I mentioned in D.C. For China, this is very important. Xinjiang, it's on their major economic initiative in the world today, which is the New Silk Road, One Belt, One Road, which comes out of China, goes right through Xinjiang, a lot of the key infrastructure, and it's an enormous undertaking, which is sort of changing the landscape of the global economy now, or risks doing that. And the Europeans are participating in this. But the main problem is on the periphery of China, inside what they call the first island chain. This is where if there's going to be conflict between our two countries, this is where it will arise. This is where you have Hong Kong, Taiwan, the South China Sea, East China Sea. China believes that the inside of the first island chain is an area that they have, they want to have strategic depth. They'll often say, look, you guys had a Monroe Doctrine. Can't you understand? Any country, large country, is going to want a periphery that is stable. Whereas we're saying, no, we're going to defend the rights of the Hong Kongers. We're going to defend Taiwan. And so this is where the military tensions are building. So the Chinese have been building sort of from underground atolls, tons and tons of sand to create islands where there are landing strips, anti-aircraft stuff, real military installations that they're building up. But it's on Taiwan that you have the real potential conflict. And things are heating up. If you look on this map at the bottom, there's something called the Dongsha Islands, or the Pratas Islands. This is where the Chinese now are exercising a lot. They're not going to attack Taiwan directly. They're not that dumb. But if things escalate, they may seize the Pratas Islands, which is Taiwanese territory. Ratchet it up. Same thing happened in the 1950s with Quemoy and Matsu, exactly the same scenario when Red China took some islands off of Taiwan. So the U.S. is bound and determined to prevent this, and we're sending our largest aircraft carriers into this area. Now, the Chinese are responding. They are telling us that actually our aircraft carriers cannot be defended, which I'm afraid is true. The Chinese now have the technology to knock out our aircraft carriers. These are floating cities of 20,000 people, if that ever happened. This is from November 5th. This was a radar image from Xinjiang of a target that the Chinese are using for bombing exercises. You can see it's an exact outline of the Navy Gerald Ford class aircraft carrier. This is an actual photo and the Chinese military depiction of what would happen. A few months ago, they sent over one of our aircraft carriers their equivalent of a B-52 bomber, an attack aircraft, and locked on to our aircraft carrier with their radar and missiles as if they were about to attack. Very provocative. That's never happened before. Because this is what the Chinese say would happen. They have missiles that are aimed at Taiwan, but that can hit our aircraft carriers that fly too low to be defended against. They now have hypersonic weapons. Same thing. That's what these little guys are coming down, in addition to their bombers. So, if this ever does get unleashed, you could have such a rapid escalation. If one of our aircraft carriers was sunk with that many deaths, what in the world would Washington do? And so I think both sides would like to avoid this. The Alaska meeting, the first meeting that took place, once again with Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, with the Chinese counterparts, as you may recall, broke down in acrimony. The basic disagreement is this. Jake and Blinken said, look, we're going to confront you where we have to. We'll cooperate, kind of a la carte, right? We'll really confront you on some issues, but we want you to cooperate on climate and this and that. And the Chinese are saying, no. It's all or nothing. Either you have a good relationship or you don't. And actually, scholars of China say that the Chinese think relationally. They think about relations among things. The I Ching, a lot of their philosophy is based on this idea of cycles and things turning into other things. They have much less of a sense of discrete plus and minus or even individuals. And so one of the top experts from Harvard on negotiating with the Chinese says, when bargaining with China, be prepared to discuss all issues simultaneously and in apparently haphazard order. Nothing is settled until everything is. So here you can see the basic dialogue of the deaf that's going on, where we're insisting on this a la carte approach, and they are resisting this. So our focus now is the Indo-Pacific region. We want to galvanize our allies to get more involved and stand up to China in this area. We are using something called the Quad. It's Japan, India, Australia, U.S. Australia is becoming our most loyal ally now in all of this, partly because the Chinese have been kind of rough with Australia recently, cutting off their imports and things. So the first virtual summit that Biden has was with the Quad. We want to get India involved. Japan, yes. The Chinese are watching this carefully, but the one that is causing the most collateral damage is an agreement between the U.S., Britain, and Australia. Now, since Brexit, Boris Johnson is playing up what he calls the Anglosphere. The future of Britain and of the world will be regional agreements, like I said, and the English-speaking Anglosphere will be a center of trade and also of security cooperation. So this is the first real Anglosphere agreement over submarines for Australia. The Australians had signed a deal with the French for a conventional diesel-powered submarine, and out of the blue, the Australians announced, nope, sorry, that deal's off. We have a deal with the British and the Americans to build a nuclear power submarine. Now, and there it is, there's the Anglosphere. It's kind of a far-flung set of alliances, but there it is. And of course, this is where we have greatly angered our European allies in this, right? This is Macron at the UN, basically protesting this agreement because it was done behind his back. At a G20 meeting a couple months before, all these three leaders were being happy, friendly with Macron, whereas in secret they were finalizing this deal. So the French are, for the first time in U.S.-French history of our relations dating back to the 1780s, France withdrew its ambassador in Washington over this. That's never happened before. So now, speeding along here, our attempt to galvanize this kind of alliance against China is flying in the face of a trend toward regionalization, as I said. That really is the trend. This is the UN official map of world regions, right? This is what the UN uses in talking about regions. And lo and behold, just right before Biden came in, there were two regional agreements struck. All of our Asian allies reached an agreement with the Chinese. And there they are. The only one who didn't was India, but that's because they're trying to protect their economy. For the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This is a major trade deal. It's going to deepen supply chains. It's an example of how our Asian allies listen to us on security, but they want to see their economic future tied to China. That's simply the way it is, especially since we pulled out of something called the TPP, which was to be, both the Democrats and Republicans drew back from that because of labor implications here in the U.S. So this is going on even as we're trying to galvanize. Japan's a part of this, Australia. So, and then on the other side, the European Union and China signed a big investment deal just before Biden took office. Jake Sullivan tried to stop them. He sent tweets and things to the Europeans saying, do not sign this, wait for us. They went ahead anyway. Now, it's also moving slowly, but still. So, yeah, you can look at these regional hegemons now. Turkey is a perfect example. Turkey's theoretically a NATO member, but they are more and more now looking at their region and you can see all the countries where they're involved militarily. And they're at odds with a couple of NATO allies on key issues. Boris Johnson pulling out of the EU. That's an example of this kind of a fragmenting that's going on. And within Britain, there's a good chance that Scotland will eventually leave. This is Nicola Sturgeon, who is for a referendum. And even Ireland is up for grabs. So things are shifting a lot out there. And it's a tough time to try to galvanize blocks. Africa actually is a positive story. They have just last year signed a continent-wide free trade agreement, 55 countries. Latin America tried to do that a decade or two ago and wasn't able to. The Africans pulled it off. It's being ratified, as you can see here. Actually, before COVID, some of the fastest growing economies in the world were in Africa. As you know, the Chinese are very active there, but as are the Japanese, the Turks. A lot of people are investing. We, not so much yet. This is a perfect example of how the U.S. government cannot force the private sector in the U.S. to do anything. Obama had a year of Africa, trying to get our corporations to invest in Africa, but there's no follow-through. Whereas China, even Japan, Turkey can kind of have a national policy on this. So now countries like Ethiopia, unfortunately, are falling into conflict. There are a lot of conflict areas. In the part of Africa where the Muslim North intersects with the South, where people tend to be Christian or anyway black Africa of the South, and the tragedy in Ethiopia right now is just horrendous. You know, the president of Ethiopia has many contacts here in the Twin Cities. There's a large Oromo population in the Twin Cities. He's come here many times to talk to them. You know, he's engaged in a civil war now, and now the Oromo and the Amhara are fighting each other. The Tigray have revolted, and forces stand on the outskirts of Addis Ababa now. There could be an attack on Addis anytime. So, and oddly, the president won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019. So how quickly these things change. Now, Africa and Brazil have been hardest hit by COVID, especially South America. Mexico, Brazil have performed very poorly. The economies have taken a big hit, and so they've got to kind of wrestle with this. And as I say, there are very few signs of kind of coming together. Frankly, this is our region. We should be doing more, it seems to me, in our own region, given the way the world is going. And of course, the Middle East now, you've got Israel. This is the Abraham Accords. So now Israel has good contacts with the UAE and other Arab countries. It's a major shift. The Palestinians are increasingly isolated. And so they see us as kind of pulling out of the Middle East now. And so it's going to be up to, you know, will Iran and Saudi Arabia settle their differences? What will Turkey's role be? It's a regional situation now. But the region we're most worried about, and this is the nightmare for Washington, is Eurasia. Because if these three countries come together, Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former National Security Advisor, always said the one thing that could upend America's role in the world and could be a threat would be if we ever succeeded in pushing Russia, China, and Iran together. And frankly, we're at loggerheads with all three. And they are meeting more and more and having joint exercises. So now, last part of my speech, I'm going to talk a little bit about what China's doing, about tech, what this future looks like. I mentioned all the STEM graduates. This is a photo from China of one of their exams. I mean, the scale of what's going on there. If we had higher resolution, we'd see that there are drones flying over this room looking for cheating. They actually use drones for this. China is, as I say, on AI and quantum computing. A few months ago, they announced the world's fastest computer, 10 billion times faster than Google's prototype, which was seen as the state of the art. What the Chinese are doing is taking a whole different approach. Quantum computing, you have these cylindrical computers, and at the bottom, very cold temperatures, where chips, traditional computer chips, are brought to super cold status, and that allows this entanglement, the very weird world of quantum. The Chinese have just ignored all that. Now they're computing on particles of light. They're computing on photons. And this is I hate to say it, this is freaking Washington out. It really is. And this kind of thing is part of the concern about China. China just had a test of an hypersonic orbital bombardment system. This is hypersonic weaponry. Everyone's developing it. There's an arms race going on that we have to get under control. It's one of these tech versus, well, not just democracy, but human survival. There's got to be more discussion of arms control and more engagement. Because these hypersonic weapons eventually will hit the Earth at Mach 14 and will do more damage than a nuclear weapon without the radiation. These are called rods from God. It's a system we're developing where 14-foot rods will be fired and will reach Mach 14, as I say, and do incredible damage and be so fast that the other side won't be able to react, which is the danger, because people will, I mean, this will lead to an instability of deterrence if it goes on any further. So these are very concerning, and not to mention cyber, of course. Now, you're going to hear a lot about China's sudden increase in its nuclear arsenal. In fact, you're already seeing the articles in the paper. They're going to increase by 5-fold their ICBM force. This is very disturbing, but you have to keep one thing in mind. This is the current status of forces. You see, so Russia has about 6,000 or more ICBM warheads, deployed about 1,600. We have about 5,400, but we've deployed about 1,800 deployed. China has not deployed any and has in the high 200s. So as it's been rising through the global economy, trying not to upset the apple cart, China has deliberately not tried to compete with us militarily, has deliberately tried not to create mutual assured destruction, right? The MAD that we had with Russia, where we could each destroy each other. China has not done that, but now they feel threatened, they say, and they are going to. So here's this huge increase that you're going to be hearing about, from 272 up to 1,000. But we're at 1,800 and 6,000, and this is not deployed. This is just the missiles deployed or not. So it's still a 6,000 to 1,000 ratio. And as I say, from the Chinese point of view, they think this is just trying to get minimal deterrence as the relationship deteriorates. And so they're building these nuclear silos right now. You'll see a lot of photos of it. You're going to hear a lot about this in the press going forward, a lot about this. And there's a book out now, just came out, Henry Kissinger, Eric Schmidt, and Daniel Huttenlocher from MIT, The Age of AI on Our Human Future. And the basic idea is that we've got to get this technology under control. We cannot have self-standing AI weaponry that we don't know what it's doing. And even the idea of AI that becomes self-learning to the point where we're not sure why it's making the decision it makes. So Kissinger says that really this technology has upset the whole idea of deterrence. And it's making it very unstable. So apparently, the first time that Kissinger met Eric Schmidt there in the middle at a conference, Schmidt introduced himself, and I'm from Google, and apparently Kissinger said, "Oh yes, Google, yes, I have heard of your country. I have of your company. I have one problem with your company. You're going to destroy the world." That was his, and it ended up in a collaboration on this book. So now, there's some positive things that are happening. I'm going to finish really quickly here. Some positive things that are happening. In Glasgow itself was a very mixed bag. The COP26 trying to produce, agreements that protect this thin blue line that we are all concerned about. Maybe the more space tourists who go up, the more there'll be awareness of how fragile everything is. So, I mean, there were a number of agreements on coal. About 100 countries signed an agreement to try to reduce coal somewhat. It's the first time that reducing coal has even been mentioned in a COP document. The problem was at the last minute, China and India put up an objection. They didn't want the word phasing out coal, so there's no commitment to phase out coal, rather to phase down coal. And the Greta Thunbergs are very upset about this, that they withdrew from this. Methane, it's not as much in the agreement, but once again, 100 countries agreed that they would try to bring their methane down. Not China, but the U.S. The U.S. is taking more of a leading role now with Biden. Forests, once again, there was an agreement, not in the document, but among 100 countries that were there, of the 200, to try to do something about forests, to slow down the deforestation. And then a lot about financing, helping developing world to adjust to climate change. They need a lot of money from us, from the West, and we have not come through on our commitments. And that's one of the problems. The commitments made at Paris and at Kyoto before that have not been realized. And that's why there's a lot of skepticism about COP26. Hopefully this will be proved wrong. But the good thing that happened there, and this is a very positive development that, well, you had Boris falling asleep. I mean, he gave a series of very weird speeches as host, talking at great length about Alice in Wonderland and whatever kind of was on his mind. I mean, Greta Thunberg must have the feeling that the fate of the planet is in the hands of a lot of very odd old men, you know, because, you know, she went there and refused to attend this time. She attended Paris, but not this. She said, this is going to be a greenwashing festival, you know, basically making promises and not following through. So she was on the streets protesting. 100,000 people protested outside of the meeting. But in the midst of all this, the U.S. and China signed a deal. This is the first bright spot in the U.S.-China relationship, really for months and months. And it's because of John Kerry. John Kerry is not on this wavelength that Jake Sullivan and company are on of compete. Kerry is much more for finding solutions with China. He really, and as he doesn't want to get into this, he says, I have my area, I'm going to just do my area. And so he and his Chinese partner here, Xi Jinping, Kerry is 77, the Chinese fellow is 72. They've been working together for 30 years on these issues. And that's the kind of cooperation and trust you need to get these kind of deals. And I think it really was Kerry who pulled this off. So an agreement, it's in general terms, but China now is saying that it has said it will peak with coal and then begin to phase out after 2030. Now they say they will begin phasing out in 2026, which is the 15th five-year plan. So a little bit of a shift. And we've set up a permanent dialogue on climate, which is also very good. And in the midst of that, then just last night, Biden and Xi Jinping had their first summit. It was by telephone. Once again, I mean, these are positive signs. And they're setting up a couple of permanent discussion, including military to military, which is very good news. So there are some bright spots now. And but they still disagree on Taiwan and these other issues just as much as they did. But anyway, hopefully we can build upon this. Now, the last part of my speech is what the Chinese are doing, because it really is a little bit mind-bending. And it is, well, the Chinese, Xi Jinping, in his speeches, basically is saying this to the Chinese people. We're living now in an era of two gilded ages. One in China, one in the US, of tremendous inequality, born partly of the technologies that we're using, but for other reasons too. And the Chinese have allowed this to happen. They've consciously allowed all these very unsocialistic trends to develop in China. And now the idea over there is that it's a whole question of who explodes first. Who gets actually racked with social upheaval first? It's going to happen. So China now is pivoting very abruptly to rein in everything. Big tech companies, finance, you name it. Now, Xi Jinping's public image that he projects is of a kind of a friend of the farmer. You know, during the Cultural Revolution, he spent a couple of years, as many Chinese did, out in the countryside. He's made a big deal about raising the poverty level, raising the incomes of rural Chinese, and they've done it successfully. This is actually happening. And so now the whole idea is what they call fanzheng, which means bringing order out of chaos. This is what the Chinese people are being told. He talks about the acute imbalances that are caused by big capital, especially the internet tech sector. It's leading to massive inequality. So the goal is to put limits on these companies, to put limits on wealth, and to redirect the profits coming from these sectors into positive development for China, which he says mainly is fostering small and mid-sized companies, especially in tech, which create 80% of the urban jobs. So, and they're saying now that the past 30 years have been a period of state capitalism in China, a temporary phase, just as Marx predicted. Marx always said that to get to socialism, you have to go through capitalism first. Right? That's why China in 1949 or Russia after World War I were not, because it's under capitalism that you create the capital, you create the Walmarts and the large corporations that the state then can direct, right? So he's trying to fit this into a basically socialist paradigm. And it's, as he always says, socialism with Chinese characteristics. So what are they doing? First, they have what's called the dual circulation policy. They're going to try to develop their own consumption. They're going to, in a sense, withdraw a bit from the world economy. They feel as if they have enough educated people now, enough capital. They have a $3 trillion surplus, unlike our huge deficit, so they got something to work with. And focus on tech advancement and high-end manufacturing above all. And then they're going to have international circulation where they're still going to allow a certain amount of trade, but they've stopped some Chinese IPOs on the Western markets. I think Chinese companies will slowly withdraw from our markets, but they're encouraging Western investment into China. Now, they've got a big problem with real estate. It's their big bubble. 40% of the Chinese banking system is tied to real estate. Real estate accounts for almost 30% of GDP. And these companies are huge and they're in debt. They have been very irresponsible. There's up to 100 million unoccupied units in China today. There's nobody there. And so, these scenes of excess, some people think it could be a crisis that could affect the global economy. Others think that China has enough financial firepower that they can keep anything from going off the rails. But the main focus now for Xi Jinping, this is as of the past 6 months, is common prosperity. So environmental goals, decarbonization, 2030, as I say, they're going to try to speed that up. Rebalance toward labor, rebalance toward their own consumption. Our economy depends 70% on our own consumption. Our manufacturing sector is about 11%. And manufacturing jobs are about 7%. So we've basically given up our manufacturing sector. We're highly financialized, as we all know, and service-oriented. So the Chinese want to go a little bit in that direction. They've been depending on exports all these years. They want now to have more of their own consumption. So we'll see. This is a risk. If you change something this fundamentally, there's a risk. And of course, we've all read about how they've been going after the big tech titans. Jack Ma got put in his place. A big ant company IPO was stopped at the 11th hour. A lot of Western investors are wondering where this is all going because they're going to strengthen the supervision over foreign capital. As she has said, we're not going to allow Western investors to obtain ultra-high profits in China through monopoly and capital market operations. That's not going to be allowed. He said letting profits in big companies grow too forcefully, powerfully, leads to inequality, social injustice, and other threats to social stability. Now, there are some rich people in China that really flaunt their wealth. I mean, even more than here. This guy, this is his private residence. It's an exact replica of the White House. This was allowed. This was allowed in this period of capital formation in China. This is Zhao Wei, one of the most famous actresses in China. She has been put in her place. She had like mansions in France, was on TikTok and things, was kind of showing off her wealth, and she has been now basically told, you must give away your wealth. In other words, the Chinese are forcing philanthropy. The super rich are being forced to be philanthropic. It's not a Chinese trait ordinarily. I mean, we have much more of that here. They're very concerned about the influence of South Korean culture, the boy bands, where a kind of a sort of multi-sexual persona is encouraged among men, and that's taking hold in China too. This is now banned. This is banned, and they're trying to get boys to be boys again, whatever that means in this world. Gaming. There's nobody more addicted to internet gaming than the Chinese. If you've ever been in China, these things go all night long, and they're all over the major cities. Just people gaming. The WHO, just this past year, made gaming an official disorder mental physical disorder, quantifiable. And especially the way it works with dopamine. All these games are geared to dopamine. And so now China, if you're 18 years older or under, you can only game 3 hours a week. Strictly controlled. 3 hours a week, period. I mean, like I say, we'll see how this works out, whether they can really pull this off. And then you've got Bitcoin. So just a month or two ago, China banned all Bitcoin. All Bitcoin. It's against the law. And any of these digital currencies. And it's against the law for somebody outside of China to try to interact with Bitcoin into China. It's all illegal. It's not that the Chinese don't like Bitcoin. They want their own digital currency. They are developing a national digital currency that will have no rivals. You can see why. If the government controls this, they know everything that's happening in the economy, right? They know everything. They know if you're trying to put things into a tax haven somewhere, they'll have total what they call panopticon. So they're saying this is a way of actually controlling the economy. China used to have really a lion's share of the Bitcoin facilities, which look like this. This is where Bitcoin is generated, this kind of a facility. They're all closed now. And this is as Wall Street actually is embracing digital currencies now. Once again, our two countries are going like in totally different directions here. So China is gearing up for its digital currency. It plans to use the Winter Olympics in 2022 to introduce a prototype digital renminbi, which will be the currency of exchange at the Olympics. So the whole world will see what's coming. Washington's concerned because this is something that could possibly diminish or even replace the dollar. And it certainly eases the Chinese from certain kinds of sanctions and such, especially if they get other countries to buy into this digital world. So China is such a developed country now. This is Shanghai. I mean, when you go there, it's almost futuristic in some parts. Can the Chinese Communist Party now tone this down in the name of stability and keep stability? That's really the key. How will the population react to this degree of control? Our foreign corporations, by the way, are more enamored of China than ever. I was at a thing with the head of the U.S.-China Business Council, and he was saying that really most sectors right now of trade are just booming. Agriculture, for example, there's no end to what the Chinese want to buy. The one area is like semiconductors. That's a problem, and anything that's under sanctions. But other things, and so China is opening up to Western finance. So Goldman Sachs has opened up there. Now they're going to be able to, even though they want to control these companies once they're there and keep parameters on them, they're going to allow them to operate. So it's a very strange mix of things. And the business community in the States is at loggerheads now with what Biden is doing in terms of the degree to which we're challenging China. The business community has interests here. I'm going to end, something that struck me just in the last few months is in Washington. The speech that everyone used to cite all the time was by John Quincy Adams, right? America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. It's the friend and well-wisher to the freedom of all, but the guarantor only of its own. You hear that all the time. Now you're hearing JFK's speech from 1963, June 1963, at American University. I'm just amazed how this is coming up. Because in that speech, and it's indicative of where Kennedy was going if he hadn't been assassinated. I mean, he was just heading in a whole different direction from the one we took under LBJ. In this speech, and later at the Mormon Tabernacle, he said, "We must recognize we cannot remake the world simply by our own command. Every nation has its own aspirations. Our assistance from time to time can help other nations preserve their independence, but we cannot make them in our own image. We cannot enact their laws, nor we can operate their governments or dictate our policies to them." And in this famous American University speech, he said, and this was, of course, during the Cold War, "If the United States and the Soviet Union cannot end now our differences, at least we can make the world safe for diversity." And I personally think that the challenge for us of Americans is to recognize diversity at home and abroad. This is a new era we're in, and we're going to have to learn to live with other civilizations. And China is a very different civilization, and with a more multipolar, yes, diverse world, just as we're trying to struggle with this at home. And I think, the fact that John Kennedy was on this back in 1963, gives me a really strong sense of what if certain things hadn't happened. Anyway, so I'll stop there. I went on too long. And any questions you have here at the end, I can stay as long as you guys can. So. Any questions or thoughts about, yes, in the back. Yes. Well, it's certainly adding to it. I think, I think that something's happening here domestically with social media and the strength of some of Twitter and Facebook, which is now called Meta, by the way. For Mark Zuckerberg, the future is the metaverse, which he plans to control. He and Google want to control where we'll spend most of our time in the future. If anybody's seen Ready Player One, the movie, it kind of depicts what's coming, perhaps. But so I think that Washington sees that China has certain advantages because of its system. We detest their system. But at least at this stage, it's got certain very strong advantages of long-term planning, of directing investment, of the way they're just focusing on education like there's no tomorrow, right? Our decentralized and deregulated system has a very hard time doing that. So there's a will to become more like China. So, for example, Marco Rubio and Mark Warner on the Intelligence Committee have been giving speeches about World War II and how we have to think of this as World War II. Now, in World War II, it was a war, and so the government steered everything. The Manhattan Project was brought together by the government. Radar. We made huge breakthroughs in radar because the U.S. government, in a war situation, was able to bring together. Now, that's what the Chinese are doing. Like on 6G, the government in China has brought together the 37 best minds of China to focus on developing 6G. They can do that. We can't, unless we declare a war or have a World War II mentality. So the problem is there's a lot of will to do this, exhortation, but the follow-through is very unclear because we cannot make companies do things. There's no way that Washington legislate this. For example, the promises that Obama made at Paris to regulate certain emissions in the U.S., we were going to regulate it, was struck down by the Supreme Court. And the present Supreme Court will be even quicker to strike down anything that's telling corporations what to do in any context. So the will is there to be more like China. But I remain to be convinced how much we can really deliver on this. We'll see. Really, what's going on between China and the U.S. is so fascinating. I find it's endlessly interesting what's happening. And so we'll see what we can do here. I mean, using China as a galvanizing threat is one way we might be able to push a few things through. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts? Yes, Bob. Well, looking back during the Cold War, the adage was politics stops at the water's edge. there was the idea was that the confrontation with the Soviet Union was so existential that parties just had to put their differences to rest when it came to foreign policy. And it wasn't perfectly practiced, but you know, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it's like the world was demagnetized. It really was. I mean, our domestic politics began to tend in the direction that they've come now. Yugoslavia fell apart. The Japanese political system was there was no galvanizing other. And so we tried terrorism for a while, war on terror, but that really was an inadequate galvanizer, as we know now. So now it's China. So, I mean, our divisions are very deep. Whether we can come to any kind of, Donald Trump with his bromance with Putin, right? In fact, his administration was harder on China on Russia than Obama had been. I mean, the Trump administration sold lethal weapons to the Ukrainians, for example. The Trump administration, the Trump administration closed all kinds of consulates, both in the U.S. and in Russia. But there was this kind of surface bromance. And because of Russian dabbling in our politics, the Democratic Party was just anything that seemed to be trying to have any kind of dialogue with the Russians was just anathema, right? Well, if you look at the world situation, probably what we should be doing, we shouldn't be pushing Russia and China together. We should try to maybe wean the Russians away from the Chinese, which is what previous thinkers like a Kissinger or a Brzezinski would have done. It would have been a no-brainer. That's simply great power politics. But that's not what we're doing. And so, that division on Russia was indicative of how hard it'll be to have a coherent foreign policy. Everyone agreed on getting out of Afghanistan. Everyone agrees that there's a big challenge from China. But we'll see. And of course, the elephant in the room is the amount of money we spend on our military. China's taking a different path. They're spending much less on their military. That's one way we could maybe copy what they're doing, maybe have a little more productive investment. But there are so many vested interests, and no party really dares to go too far at this point in that direction. But no, it's tough. It's tough. And as I said, if things are undone administration to administration, in Trump's case, it was out of pique against Obama. He just anything Obama had done was undone. Well, how stable is that for a foreign policy, really? So, any last thoughts or questions? Yes. Ignored his aspirations, yes. Yes. Yeah. Yep. No, it's not. That's a key point. Yep. 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 Yeah, we're kind of playing on two different chessboards. I mean, we still are in the mindset of containment. We're very much seeing China through the prism of the old Soviet Union. China is involved in an economic mobilization policy, both at home and then in like with the Belt and Road and that kind of thing. And you know, the the United States rose in the 19th century in contrast to Europe by not spending a lot on our military. That's how we, in fact, European analysts say that's, the Europeans were spending each other into the ground in the competition in Europe, whereas the U.S., we were blessed by our geography. We had no immediate threats at hand. And so we had very embryonic military all through the 19th century, really up until World War I. And so the Chinese are kind of doing the same thing. They're actually taking our 19th century playbook in many ways. So I don't know how we wean ourselves away, but it's a different kind of world today. It's not the 1950s. And for better or worse, we have a president who remembers the 1950s and who is of that generation, very, very deeply of that generation. And so anyway, maybe the new generations here in the U.S. will see things differently. When I look at my students at the U, they seem much more aware that the world is different. I mean, their own prospects here in the U.S. are different from my generation, that's for darn sure. And they're kind of aware that it's a much more multipolar world. And I've had students say to me, wow, wasn't the Cold War boring, actually? It was so set in place. This is much more challenging and intriguing. So, but I don't know. There are a lot of vested interests, a lot of lobbies to keep things the way they are. No question. Yes? I don't think, okay, unless they are severely provoked, like even in the conversation yesterday, which had some positive elements between Biden and Xi, apparently Xi said, look, I mean, there are red lines, and if Taiwan declares independence and starts taking concrete steps, we'll have to react. And they're blaming us for giving the Taiwanese kind of a moral hazard. I mean, it's just like 1956 with the Hungarian uprising. The Hungarians thought we would come to their aid because Radio Free Europe had been telling them, yep, boy, we'll defend you if you raise up for freedom. Of course, we weren't going to come to their aid. And so what the Chinese are saying to Biden is, look, I mean, just be careful here. It's in our interest to stay. I mean, kind of urging us to kind of keep a little bit of a lid on the Taiwanese, which we always used to do. We always used to do that. Under Clinton, we basically made it clear to the Taiwanese that, we were for peaceful unification and that, this should go that way. So, we're trying to tell the Taiwanese, I mean, we realize we cannot defend Taiwan. We can't. So what we're trying to tell the Taiwanese is stop depending on our F-16s and things. Develop a kind of a guerrilla resistance strategy. So that, okay, China takes Taiwan, but then they face tremendous guerrilla resistance, and it almost feels like a new Afghanistan. We would then aid the opposition, right? That's what we're telling them now, which I don't know. That doesn't seem too realistic either. No, the danger is that it would escalate. That an unintended conflict would quickly escalate, and hopefully not, but possibly become nuclear. Now, the other thing is this: the Chinese and the Russians are cooperating more and more and more. So just a few months ago, the Chinese were stepping up their flights over Taiwan, and the Russians had begun their buildup around Ukraine. And suddenly Washington says, oh my God, what if both crises break out at once? What if the Russians and Chinese coordinate and the Russians take Ukraine or go after a big part of Ukraine and the Chinese do something on Taiwan? What will we do? So there was a lot of discussion of that in Washington. The basic idea is that we want to remain the preeminent power in Asia and in Europe. We learned in World War II that if another power dominates either Europe or Asia, it can threaten our homeland, potentially. So the bedrock of U.S. foreign policy since World War II has been to prevent that from happening. So the best way that we can prevent Russia from becoming dominant or China becoming dominant is to make sure that they don't take Ukraine and Taiwan. Those are seen in Washington as the big pawns that if we let them go, we could face a peer competitor. Because Taiwan, the whole semiconductor industry it's like an aircraft carrier off of China, right? So in terms of our containing them, it's a major asset. And similarly, a lot of people think if Russia ever got Ukraine back again, they would be that much stronger. So I don't agree with that logic. I think that's old peer competitor logic, but that's the way Washington thinks. So anyway, but I don't think the Chinese, I mean, unless something really egregious happens, I don't think the Chinese will invade. They might take that island I showed you. They might do that. Yeah. The Chinese are not dumb. And they have a long-term sense of a long-term rise. I once met a Russian economist who claimed that he had held in his hands the 100-year Chinese economic plan. He said, it exists, and I held it, and it's huge. I mean, it's obviously got to be very notional, but they think long-term. So, well, you've been very patient. Thank you very much, and look forward to next year.